find it super impressive how you navigate to continue doing the process, stay in that sort of work, even though your financial situation, family situation, what others might say, like, I can't do that because of these reasons, you still do it.
Yeah, am I absolutely bonkers, or I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty committed to the process, and yeah, it's just been super up and down for like over a decade, and I think what's interesting, and we've talked about this before, the broader and deeper I become in terms of my capacity to kind of like make sense and thus contribute, the harder it is to participate in the kind of like narrowness of our current economic paradigm. And yeah, but there is a lot to be said, and I've had a lot of tension for years and years, because I've learned more and more and more about kind of like, our historicity and how kind of things work. And I'm like, oh my goodness, there's all these problems to attune to, all these amazing things as well, right? So it's all that we're always going to be referencing sort of like polarities and stuff. And but there is a lot to be said about working through that tension and finding ways to be okay with at least having enough. Because, and a bunch of people have encouraged me to go into that more, and I need to, I'm still, that is an active process. Like, I'm still trying to reorient my relation to money for heaps of different reasons. Because if you have your fundamental needs met, your capacity to engage with openness and vibrancy and intentionality, etc., is significantly enhanced. Whereas if you're always struggling financially, and thus that will probably mean struggling in other ways too, then I think your capacity to contribute is limited in different ways. And that's not to say, like, I'm not doing it, I've had some good times and bad times, and some good times and bad times, but yeah, that process definitely isn't ideal. Like, one of our episodes talked about like cultivating conditions, like favorable conditions for philosophying. Those aren't particularly good conditions for properly philosophying and using that philosophying in service of others and world process and whatnot. So yeah, I don't know, it's an like, I think what I'm going through right now is hopefully the kind of like crescendo of a bit of a phase. Fingers crossed. And and then yeah, some new things will open up, and hopefully I can find that better sort of balance between orienting towards what I think is quite a purposeful and meaningful way of being in this world, given the skills I have and the experiences I have, etc., whilst also finding ways to meet the most fundamental needs, and particularly support my my family. So, but this is, yes, I'm having a lot of conversations like this at the moment, Jess. Heaps of people are going through it. It doesn't seem to be
I see
unique
that
at all.
too. No,
Yeah.
I see that in so many ways. I think this tension of people, being fed up on the one hand, fed up with, just following the system, which we don't want to be part of, and at the same time being so caught up in it that it's very hard to completely escape. And yeah, I've been thinking about this recently, and about the, money in general. And I think there is something good to money. I mean, it's amazing what money has created in a way,
For
or
sure.
has allowed us to create. So but just our relationship to it has become so obscure, and putting it in front of everything else, the economic growth. So the lack of balance is maybe more so a problem than money in itself. I know too little about the history of it to actually have an informed opinion.
It's pretty interesting. Like, I am not a historian of money, but when I've gone into it, I've been kind of fascinated, and I actually I think that what you call attention to is really important. Like this capacity that we have to agree on some type of exchange in a way that sort of scales was necessary to enable growth of human population, complexification of society and civilization. It's, you know, sort of like absolutely. But the context within which it was wrapped up, I think, probably meant that the overwhelming sort of like probabilistic likelihood was that it would kind of become something like what it has largely become. And it's interesting because I don't know how, you know, from you, I'd be really interested in your take on this. You know, there's a lot of work over the last 10 years or so to financialize nature. And a lot of people in that space have great intentions, I believe, because they're like, we're not getting rid of money, so we have to include this, right? We can't keep leaving it out of the models. Like we have to include it. What's your take on that? What's your take on like widening the boundaries of what is financially included, given how narrow that has been in the past, even within the human population itself? You know, so many people entirely disenfranchised and not economically recognized for such a long period of time. So like, yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I love that question. It's something I'm sitting with a lot as well, because I do see the value in it, and I see how, you know, people who might not intuitively have a sense for the nature, for the more than human world, that, you know, putting a money or a tag on it somehow helps them to grasp what it's worth. But I think at the same time, the whole language, and it's is not limited only to financial gains that we might get out of nature in the long run, but also, you know, if we just talk about it in terms of our own well-being and how it enhances our own well-being, you know, if we go forest bathing and stuff like that, I think it also takes away, or it risks taking away, you know, the intrinsic value that it has just because, and kind of continues our way of thinking of like, yeah, everything needs to be a means to a certain end, and instrumentalized in some way. And like I said, I also see the value on the other hand. Like, for example, when I talk to my students about this, who have usually an economics background and are more interested in the business side, you know, I often talk about the business case of sustainability. And it's like I'm sitting with that tension very deeply, you know, it cringes me at some level. And at the same time, I see how it's for them, you know, starting to seep into their consciousness and like, yeah, good point, and like formulating it in a language and in a way for them to grasp it better. One thing I once read, I think it might have been by Charles Eisenstein, but maybe someone else, who talked about like, you know, we all have, or most of us have, some story that we can connect to the natural world, where we're like, oh yeah, we love that, you know, was it, if it was maybe the forest behind our house when we were younger, or a certain landscape that we like to go to, or something that we hold quite dear. And if we think about it in terms of that, like asking like what would happen if that vanished, you know, just this intrinsic connection to it, then people relate to it differently. And I can definitely say that for myself, and I've tried it with students as well, and they usually have a story of like certain mountains or landscapes or so that they feel very connected to. Yeah. What's your take on it?
I think we're pretty aligned, actually. It just made me think, though, you're talking about whether it was Charles Eisenstein or someone else. My partner and I are doing like this whole like sort of like series of art projects at the moment. She's a model and an artist and other things professionally, but you know, and so she's bringing her skill set, and I'm sort of doing the photography, right? And we're going into all these really interesting landscapes, and most of them have been about trying to sort of express the beauty of the human form in its natural sort of like evolutionary context, like in, you know, in the quote unquote natural world. and so we went through a series of kind of like projects with that sort of focus. And the most recent one we did, which we just did on the weekend, we tried to get into the Melbourne docks, and it wasn't possible. We would have had to do something like pretty crazy to get in, and for various reasons we were like, we shouldn't do that, but we found this spot sort of out the back, and ended up shooting right alongside a river with the shipping containers in the background and stuff like that, and then some signs like danger. Like, it was really interesting. I'll send it over once we
Yeah.
publish. And we're calling it like, where did all the color go? And I think it'll make sense. But that's sort of what we're getting at, is this point that Charles has made about, like, how will we feel when this inherent biophilia that all of us have is gone,
Yeah.
right? Just like sitting with that, meditating on that is pretty intense.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, like, that's very alive constantly for us right now. But like, because of that, it really hit home.
I,
Yeah.
if I wonder, because how you just framed it, the biophilia that we all feel. So one thing that I also have a quite innate feeling of is like this love for the planet sometimes, and like this deep emotions also when thinking about being destroyed and the grief that comes with it. And I know there's recently there's been quite a lot of grief work around that, but I still find that this is in if you're not in specific circles, like this sort of thinking is still considered rather naive, childish, like, yeah, why do you care about that? Like, if I save an insect or so, like I do that quite a
Yeah.
lot. And then, people who are not in my bubble are like, what the heck are you doing? um, and yeah, I think
Yeah, gosh.
our perception of that and the general story around that is also still caught up in so much. And I can see the same, I think, in the organizational context, companies who do have this ambition of actually making these changes, they're, they are considered naive and ideological, and yeah, maybe risk not being taken seriously.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much in that. I just, maybe before getting into that, I'll just come back to the financialization really quickly.
Yes.
So the first thing that I thought of when we were going there is like, it's this instrumental versus non-instrumental sort of take on value. And I actually think there's an argument to make that all instrumental value ends up being non-instrumental if you kind of like almost do like a version of the 5 whys on it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a different story potentially. So I think it's beautiful that you brought that up. I think if we were able to look at something like this as, let's say, using Sharpe's sort of 3 horizons framework, if we were to look at it as like a H2 plus, but very carefully. So we had to be very careful about how we did it, but we recognized that it was part of aiding some type of overall transitionary process, then I think we could potentially do it rather well, and it would aid that transitionary process. The problem is, I don't think there's really a meta perspective on that anywhere. And so if there isn't the meta perspective on that, then it's very likely to end up being a H2 minus.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
That's probably my main concern. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people, very smart, very caring people working on those things that are aware of this, right? And much more intimately attuned to that sort of ecology and how it's kind of playing out, like what's being done, how is it being done, what are the veracity of certain claims, where are the limitations on things, like, but I'm concerned that we don't really have that shared meta perspective. And as a result of that, it's probably going to end up being a H2 minus thing rather than a H2 plus thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Tricky, huh?
And
Tricky.
and now that you talked about meta perspective, and I know you wanted to say something else as well about the other aspects that I brought up, but I just want to say this is also something I'm noticing, and also something I've dug into a little bit when I thought about like how do we do research from different paradigms, and how do we bring rather conventional scientific approaches together with more relational approaches. And I think this ability of shifting perspectives from, going meta to going deeply into it. It's such a fundamental skill. I think a lot of the crisis can, often people refer to it as a relationship crisis, and I do myself. And it's like really the relationships between different parts and wholes that are not working so well and on many facets. And from parts being wholes, holes of other wholes, a Holland model, it requires that we basically take in each of these perspectives and different meta and micro perspectives. And if this was part of our regular practice of doing that, I think a lot of things would shift. I had that experience in the recent philosophy gyms that we did as well, when we were in the process and sometimes getting almost into discussions, even though, this was not the intention. We needed, and we did rather well, I think, that we brought in the meta perspective, and then suddenly the whole atmosphere in the room shifted of like seeing, yeah, what are we doing? And, also looking at ourselves from a more meta perspective. And like this ability to shift between these different layers, I find super fascinating.
Gosh, where that kind of compels me to go is like, so let's say you take, and again, I'm not going to do that. So a few caveats. One, so last episode we recorded, I referred to our First Nations peoples here in Australia, very broad and diverse, long living group of peoples. I am not one of those peoples. I'm not speaking for them. And I'm also not trying to glorify the past, because there's a risk that there are risks in doing that. What I'm interested in is learning from, so that we can go forward better together. But I just want to frame that up front. So what I sort of feel compelled to go towards is, so there is this hypothesis that after humans sort of first came to this continent, within about 1,000 years, all the megafauna died out. And it seems like, as far as we can tell, there's a causal-ish relationship. Like it was, and why? For various different reasons. We see that pattern in other parts of the world, all this jazz, right? We become in this unique way the sort of apex species. And after that, it seems like the various groups, cultures, language groups, etc., that called this, very vast continent home, probably started cultivating a lot of the stewardship practices that, thankfully, but really only recently, they've become so recognized for. Now, there's a lot of gaps in my knowledge about that whole thing and how it plays out, but there's something very interesting there. So they didn't have the scientific instrumentation that we have today. They didn't have the same, civilizational complexity and all of this stuff. But through various different means, practices, rituals, ways of being, doing, and becoming that were inherently relational, they found ways to live in this dynamic balance, like in recognition of something like that apex species that they were. It was like there was a custodian type role bestowed upon. Do you know what I mean? So where I'm going with that is, although that doesn't have the scientific complexity of understanding scales and magnitudes and relations between parts and wholes, recognizing the parts are always wholes in their own right, what I mean? The holonic sort of view. They were living that way kind of anyways. And it's interesting because a part of me goes like, my daughter's just showing me she's found some blue tack, which is wonderful to play with. So it's almost like we've had to go through this, like this historicity that we're talking about, this the philosophical, as in the formal philosophical, and then the scientific and yada yada. It's almost like we have to go through this process of reductionism, and then reductionism is really useful, but actually it's super limited, and it can't be the only thing that we rely, you know what I mean? Okay, so we got to start looking, and it's like, I wonder if we're just going to end up back where somewhere like where these folks were, but through incredibly different means. My dog's trying to get on me now. There she is.
Oh, oh. What's her name?
She's blind, Nala, and but she's very much a little daddy's girl. So, yeah. But do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I don't know if that's just me being sort of ridiculous and playful, or whether there's maybe something to that. But
yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think there's so much to it, and yeah, it reminds me of. I'm constantly referring to books, but I do read a lot. So I've just read this book where she talks about the different. I think she talks. The title is really sort of stupid. I think it's Stairways to Heaven or something like that. But the theory behind it's closely related to other developmental theories and stage theories. But she describes it quite beautifully, in my opinion, of like how we are starting out very innocent, where we actually, as children, where we actually see ourselves connected, or rather as part of the whole. We don't even see ourselves as separate. And then basically going through this in deep process of separation, and also becoming egoistic, but that is part of then the power and the ambition that we gain in that phase is actually necessary in order to bring that same ambition, power, egoistic drive, or what we learn in our rather egoistic phases or self-centered phases, to bring that back into improving the whole, and then eventually ending up there again. And I had this conversation with various people recently. One of them, Leonie, who works at IPEP, like she also said like she would love to be able to somehow embody wisdom and be a very deep and serious and committed thinker, but at the same time she loves to keep aware and awake her playfulness. And I think like if I look at, I don't think there's such a thing as sages really, but those people who are like the Dalai Lama or so, who maybe actually have a wisdom that others or are wisdoming in a way, or rising in a way that others are not. I mean, they do have this playfulness as well. And for me, I remember a couple of years ago, I had that same sense of thinking like, actually, all this process, and eventually I want to end up where I started in a sense. But it does, and it's sort of ending up there. But at the same time, there's such a unique information that you get through the whole process that makes it very, very completely different, and actually aware of what's happening. Because when you're staying in this innocence phase, you're not aware of what's happening.
So like I'm not sure I'm aware of the specific developmental theory that you're referring to, but thankfully there often is enough commonality that if you get a bit of so I think I can get enough of the gist in this context to return the serve a little. And so it brings up a few things. One, my partner's best friend, recently we were at home together on like a Sunday evening or whatever, and I remember her sort of saying, and I don't think she'd mind me sort of saying this, like, I wish I could just go back to what it was like when I was at this approximate age. And she was describing sort of why. And we're like, yeah, of course, like that's so wonderful. But like, of course, but of course, at the same time, there is no going back. And I think this is a really interesting thing. Like, what is the developmental progression that we can sort of not equivocate, make equivalent with like that return to innocence. And it makes me think of something like the pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic sort of psychosocial paradigms as they're described. Recognizing that once you become post-tragic, it's not like an end state that's static. Like stuff's gonna happen because you're still living in the world and the world is still worlding, and then you're gonna fall back into the tragic, and then it makes me think about the mirroring. So how we talked about the last episode, we were talking about the relation between conscious belief, nervous system patterning and how we can shift our conscious belief. And that doesn't necessarily just repattern the nervous system, because although there's a relation, a very strong relation in certain ways, they are decoupled enough that they sort of have to go through different processes in relation over different periods of time. And then we were mirroring that up to like humans organizing, i.e. organizations. And it's like, okay, so it kind of makes sense at these different levels. What you're talking about, an individual going through, feels pretty resonant with what we're going through at the kind of species level in some way, at least in recent-ish times, like the last few thousand years. Which is super fascinating, depending on how mystical you want to get with it, right? Yeah, which is cool. So I don't know, there's a lot there, but I think it's beautiful that you brought that up.
Yeah. It's actually I think it's something that reminds me a little bit of what we talked about earlier, of the different levels and the meta level, and being able to shift in these levels of awareness, basically. Because when we are, at the very micro level, or if we are really not meta at all, we could also say this is sometimes what we also refer to as flow state. So something positive, when we're really in the moment and just enjoying it. And there's so much research now on how this is, increasing our well-being. And I think there's a very good point in being in that state. And, if I consider how maybe, the very foundational state where we're coming from is rather this flow-like state of being, and the innocent state. And then, we move beyond that, and maybe we fall out of that space completely. And then eventually, hopefully, there's these different levels that we can integrate. But I do think, I sometimes wonder, what if I was asked the question, if I was to go back to that rather innocent, like just living in the moment and having the greatest time of my life, sort of, that.
And that's what drugs are for.
Exactly.
But in a slightly more serious way, what's happening in terms of brain connectivity on the classic psychedelics is not that dissimilar from brain activity in relatively young children, like approximately 5 years old. So there's something interesting there, for sure. Yeah. Also, like, I think there's so many things that we can romanticize, and I'm a hopeless romantic. I think a hopeful romantic, actually, in certain ways. But so the prefrontal cortex, latest estimates suggest it's more like mid-30s where we achieve something like full prefrontal cortex development. Which a little bit later than previously expected, almost a decade or so, right? And I'm not suggesting that brain is equal to mind, because guess what? We still don't know. But they are at least intimately interconnected and perhaps interdependent, and to varying degrees, right? Not going to traverse the philosophy of mind literature right now, because that might send some people to sleep. But these faculties afford us incredible privileges. And what I love about what you're saying is, I think there is, in sort of like a transcendence type of way, or a transformation type of way, it's like we're adding to, and the adding is force multipliers, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like, so it's not just like this one developmental bit of progress equals, it's like, oh, whoa, it really, the order of complexification sort of is mirrored in, I don't know, possibility of whatever, I don't know, life experience, or and so it's kind of like I think we want to really cultivate these higher order capacities, because, for instance, if we stayed as we were when we're 5, we wouldn't be metacognitive at all. But we have the capacity to be relatively metacognitive, and that's really awesome, because that can help build this second character that we were talking about, last week. and actively and agentically evolve ourselves. Like, how amazing is that, that you have the capacity to direct your own kind of like character development and kind of like, you know, evolution within the scale of your own life.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing. But I don't think we lose those faculties. I think they become harder to connect with and
Uh-huh.
experience. And so perhaps when we're in flow states, it's something like that. And so creating favorable conditions for flow states is really important. I'm a little bit of an explorer of consciousness in different ways. And so I think there are other ways to do it also. You could engage in, say, certain breath work or meditative practices, or some people, although there are certain risks in doing this, find transcendental like benefits from fasting. But doing water fasting unsupervised is not medically recommended for various different reasons. Refeeding can be complicated and even dangerous and life-threatening for some people, yada yada. Then there's compounds, right, that can be utilized in various different contexts, as we know, more or less thoughtful. That's not a value judgment. I'm not saying if you take something when you're partying that you're about, you know, that's bad. Like, that could be amazing. You can have the best night ever. But you know, in these sort of ritualistic settings, they seem to aid the types of experiences that very few of us would have the opportunity to
Yeah.
experience otherwise. Maybe at all. You know, you hear incredibly advanced meditators having some very interesting experiences, and certain types of breath work can elicit fractals in terms of visual, you know, it's like taking LSD or whatever. It's very, but so yeah, I don't know. I think it's this, and it's keeping with the theme that we often are working with and massaging. It's like this, yes, and this plus that equals much more. It's all of these things. It's like, so we engage in this incredibly loving, awe-inspiring, sort of reverent relationship with the world, and then some of that magic and beauty kind of fades, and then we sort of get brought into reality or down to reality, or you know what I mean, all these frames that are used, or the phrases that are used, and we have to learn to be with that process as we're going through sort of developmental complexification, and you know, learning about where do we fit in this whole thing, until we can kind of like move beyond that. So we've gone through those phases, and then we can find ways to return to that kind of like deep interconnectedness, perhaps, that we expect. I don't know. Look, I'm not a developmental theorist. There's so many gaps in all of my knowledge. Like, I might be talking out my butt, but I think I'm well enough read across a number of these things that that's not entirely nonsensical. There could be something like that going on, and I think, in fact, I think there is something like that going on, and even just from my first person experience, you know, my lived experience, there's something like that going on. And there's so much beauty in being with that process and like attuning to your own developmental complexification and participating in it actively. Yeah. And we need to do all the levels, right?
Yeah. I love that. And I'd be curious if you are if you feel inclined to share a little bit about your own process, because I think that's often, yeah, I mean, it's different for each person, but nonetheless, it's so, or at least I always find it fascinating to
What
hear.
about I just ranted, so why don't you go first? Like, what's it been like for you? Like, what, you know, I know that you obviously have you know, the backing of all of your formal education and stuff like this, which I think has been in service and probably inspired some of your own active agentic development. But I don't know, what's this